Virginia laws, and people may be familiar with this, all the torturous definitions of what constitute a Negro, 1/4, 1/16, one drop, and so on. In the face of such absurdities, Allen says, let's take a closer look at the nature of the oppression. Let's analyze racial oppression as we would analyze gender oppression, class oppression, national oppression. Let's look at the characteristics of it. So he does that, and he thinks it provides firmer footing, and he wants to get away from the phenotype, the skin color-based understanding of racial oppression. So he describes some characteristics of racial oppression: reduction of all members to an undifferentiated social status, some other defining characteristics, declassing legislation. All this is, again, online: deprivation of civil rights, legalization of literacy, and displacement of family rights. Current day, we still have many aspects of this today, just updated. Right. And the first of subject, but he's also not only going to look at the nature of the oppression, but how they're able to maintain it, how they're able to set it up. And that's the social control aspect: racial oppression and social control. So what he does is very interesting. He looks in the Irish mirror, and he looks at the history of Ireland. And many people here might not be familiar with it. I was not so familiar with the history of Ireland, but it's fascinating in the way the British treated the Irish, right? And he argues, and I think it's rather convincing, so I encourage you to look at it, that Irish history presents a case of racial oppression without reference to skin color, or as the jargon goes, phenotype, because the English and the Irish, same skin color, if you will, right? So Allen maintains that a comparative study of Anglo-Norman, which goes way back, but Protestant ascendancy in Ireland and white supremacy in continental Anglo-America demonstrates that racial oppression is not dependent on differences in skin color. You can have racial oppression without it, right? He says the essential elements existed in both places. He goes through that. He also distinguishes between racial oppression and national oppression. Now, in the left, there was this history, as was alluded to earlier today, of national oppression derived from Soviet nationality theory. But Allen's going to distinguish between racial oppression and national oppression. And one of the key differences is, where does the group that helps maintain social control come from? And in racial oppression, it's from the oppressor group, but in national oppression, sector of the oppressed group that is promoted. And that's how one of the things. So he argues in Virginia, persons of discernible non-European ancestry were denied a role in the social control buffer, whereas in the Caribbean, mulattoes were included in the social control group. One of the key reasons has to do with demographics and class struggle, and also down in the Caribbean, I mean, it's capital production, it's sugar production, more capital intensive. There's a host of reasons which Allen goes into. He also talks about how racial oppression can change to national oppression, as we see in Ireland around 1800, and as we see in the Anglo-Caribbean. So this is really looking, a socioeconomic approach to these issues. He talks about the Irish sea change. This is very fascinating. He talks about how the Irish, who hate the British with a passion because of the oppression they faced, come to the U.S., and in a matter of generations, in Ireland, they're opponents of slavery and supporters of abolition. Within a couple generations here in the U.S., they become opponents of abolition and supporters of slavery. But he's not blaming it at the bottom, because he identifies the forces which are really pushing that. And they include the plantation elite and related financial interests. The mayor of New York, a fellow named Fernando Wood, was tied in very much with the slaveocracy. He talks about the Catholic Church hierarchy and its role, and Tammany Hall. We're ending volume 1, and we're getting to the meat of this, volume 2, in 1 second. So he talks about how after emancipation, the ruling elite opts for white reconstruction. Again, they decided to maintain social control. They're going to use the same system that had been used in the South. And key ingredients are free land, immigration, and industrial employment. And by industrial employment, this brings it back to North Carolina a little, talking about the lily white textile industry, the cotton textile industry, and things like this, right?